My name is Arthur Vance. I am 68 years old. I spent my life repairing rusty ship hulls on the docks of Seattle, and now I live within the confines of my wheelchair under Washington's gray skies. I never imagined I would one day tell this story, put it into words. These are usually the terrible tragedies you see on the evening news, things that happen to other people, not things that someone of your own blood would inflict on you in your own living room. But life is the cruelest screenwriter. What I'm going to tell you today is how a single message my 90-year-old mother sent during an ordinary Sunday dinner changed my life forever, and how, during that same meal, I uncovered the darkest, most sickening betrayal a father could ever face. It was a rainy, gloomy Sunday, as usual. My son Ethan was strangely insistent on preparing a special feast at home that day. "Dad, don't bother, don't even move a muscle. I'm the chef today," he said. His voice had that artificial cheerfulness reminiscent of his childhood. Ethan is 35. He is my only source of pride, my only possession in life. After my stroke 5 years ago, when my left side was paralyzed and I was confined to this metal chair, I thought he would be my hands and feet. I thought I knew him better than my own damaged body. My mother, our grandmother Clara, was with us that evening too. Despite her advancing age and trembling hands, her mind was still razor sharp. She was the kind of woman who saw the shadows no one else noticed, who heard what was left unsaid. That night, her skeptical eyes would be the only thing to sense the approaching storm. The table had been set by Ethan with the meticulousness of a restaurant. Candles, starched napkins. But there was a palpable tension in the air. Ethan was shuttling back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room, checking that everything was perfect. As I rolled my wheelchair up to the head of the table, I said, "It's just dinner, son. We're not hosting the Queen," trying to smile with my paralyzed lip. But he insisted it was a new beginning. My mother, Clara, sat silently in her armchair in the corner, watching us, her knitting needles clutched tightly in her lap. Her gaze didn't miss a single detail, not even the fine beads of sweat gathering on Ethan's forehead. When we sat down at the table, Ethan served my plate first, with such excessive care that it made me uncomfortable. "Dad, your favorite roast. Just the way you like it, well seasoned and tender." I noticed she hadn't even touched her fork to her plate. She was just staring at her wrinkled hands in her lap, with a blank expression I couldn't understand. The silence in the room was heavier than the steam rising from the food. At that moment, I felt the phone in my lap vibrate. With my non-paralyzed right hand, I grabbed the phone and secretly looked at the screen from under the table. The message was from my mother, Clara. This was very strange. She was sitting right across from me, 2 meters away. Why would she text instead of talking? But when I read the words on the screen, an icy chill ran down my spine. "Son, don't eat. Pretend you feel sick. Get out immediately. Trust me." I looked up at her in shock. The misty look of old age was gone from her eyes, replaced by a sharp, commanding, and fearful determination. I didn't think twice. My mother didn't speak without reason. I suddenly brought my right hand to my stomach and grimaced. I hunched forward in my chair. "Dad, what's wrong?" Ethan asked. His voice held not so much concern as panicked impatience. "I don't know, son," I groaned. "My stomach... I have a strange cramp in my stomach. I need to go to the bathroom." I hung onto the armrest of my wheelchair and headed down the hallway to the hum of the motor. "Dad, wait. It's just gas pains. It'll pass. Your food will get cold," Ethan insisted, suddenly jumping to his feet. In that moment, in that brief second, I sensed that something was terribly wrong. The pleading tone in his voice wasn't a child's affection, but the helplessness of a man afraid of a plan going awry. I didn't turn back. I sped up my wheelchair and crossed the hallway. What happened in the next few minutes would change the rest of my broken life forever. If this story, which breaks a father's heart, has already touched you, please leave a like so this old and tired man knows he is not alone. Subscribe to the Notes from a Wheelchair series so you don't miss the next episodes I will share by opening my heart. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been saved from an impending disaster thanks to the intuition of someone who loves you? Knowing which city you're reading these lines from would make me happy. Looking back, I see that everything actually began much earlier. My childhood was simple but peaceful. I grew up right here, in the working-class neighborhoods of Seattle, back in those days when kids played soccer even in the rain. My mother, Clara, was always the rock of our family. My father was a crane operator at the docks, a man of few words, a stern man who taught me the sanctity of honesty and hard work. "Arthur," he would say, squeezing my shoulder with his calloused hands, "a man's spine must stand straight. His word must be his bond." Of course, he couldn't have known then that one day my spine would fail me, that I would become dependent on a pile of metal. But I never forgot that my character must stand tall. Clara, my mother, always had uncanny intuition. When I was a child, she knew my guilt before I even opened my mouth to lie. "Your eyes speak, Arthur, so keep your mouth shut," she would say. Every time I tried to cover up a misdeed, I was met with her piercing gaze that said, "I already know everything." Once, when I was 12, she stopped me from going swimming with my friends in a restricted area off the Puget Sound coast. I cried, I screamed, I slammed doors in adolescent rage, but she wouldn't budge. "Not today," she said simply. "I have a bad feeling about it." That day, a strong current swept 2 children away in that restricted area. When I asked my mother how she knew while watching the evening news, she just whispered, continuing to knit, "A mother's heart, child. It doesn't see, it feels." I grew up admiring his talent, his power to see the unseen, and also fearing it a little. Over time, I realized that this was not magic. It was an extraordinary attention to human behavior, micro-expressions, and the slightest changes in the atmosphere. He read between the lines of life. When I married my late wife, Linda, it was Clara who first warned me about Ethan's mother. "That woman isn't right for you, Arthur. Her heart doesn't beat in time with yours," she said a week before the wedding. I was young, in love, and foolish. I accused my mother of jealousy, of not being able to share her son. Years later, when Linda left me alone with Ethan, who was 5 at the time, and ran off to California with a richer man, I had to face my mother's sad but justified gaze. "I wish I had been wrong," she said as she hugged me. From that moment on, my life focused on 2 things: my job at the dock and raising Ethan with the strong body I had before I was confined to a wheelchair. Clara offered to live with us, but my pride wouldn't allow it. "I'll manage, Mom. I'm a man," I said. Yet healing a child's wounds, especially those of a child abandoned by his mother, required more than just being a man. Ethan was a docile but insatiable child in his childhood. While other children played with wooden sticks in the park, he always wanted the brightest, battery-operated toy in the shop window. After his mother Linda left us, I tried to fill the enormous silence in the house with material things. Maybe it was guilt. It was a silent way of saying, "You don't have a mother, but look, you have this wonderful remote-controlled car." Clara, my mother, was more energetic back then. She would often come to our house, tidy up the messy kitchen, and give me her famous warnings. "You're watering him wrong, Arthur," she would say, scrutinizing Ethan as if he were a plant. "Children need boundaries, not toys. Every yes you give him makes a future no more devastating." Still, I didn't listen to her. Maybe I gave in to fill the void Linda left behind. Or maybe just to see a smile on Ethan's face when I came home exhausted in the evenings. The most expensive bikes, the latest game consoles, brand-name sneakers. To afford it all, I worked double shifts on the Seattle docks, under that freezing wind. As the calluses on my hands hardened, my son's character softened, became shapeless. When Ethan hit puberty, his desires grew along with his body. Smartphones, computers, ski trips with friends. As a father addicted to seeing him happy, I reached for my wallet every time. I will never forget the day I gave Ethan a second-hand but shiny sedan as a gift on his 18th birthday, gleaming brightly in front of the door. As I watched him wave the keys in the air and run straight to the driver's seat instead of hugging me, Clara came over to me. Leaning on her cane, she said, "You're raising a disaster, Arthur, not a man." Her voice wasn't reproachful, more like a sad prophecy. Anything gained without effort is a burden to its owner. I was angry with her that day. Today, I am crushed under the weight of those words. Time flowed like water. Ethan graduated from college, joined a marketing company, and seemed to be standing on his own 2 feet. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, my personal apocalypse struck. 5 years ago, it was an ordinary Tuesday at the pier. A vein in my brain, unable to withstand the fatigue of the years, burst. When I opened my eyes in the hospital, my left side was immobile, like a lump of lead, and the world was now nothing more than the view from a wheelchair. I had to retire. I had my severance pay and my savings. I wasn't rich, but I had enough to live with dignity, without needing anyone, and to leave Ethan a reasonable inheritance. Or so I thought. Right around this time, as I was embarking on a new battle with my body, cracks began to appear in Ethan's behavior. Secret phone calls, sudden outbursts of anger, and endless requests for loans under the guise of starting a business or investment opportunities. "Dad, there's a big future in this crypto business," he would say. Or, "Dad, this startup is going to explode. I need capital." The details were always vague, the terms always confusing. My mother, Clara, in her mid-80s, could see the fish in the murky water even back then. He says, "Arthur, there's something wrong with this kid. He wants a lot of money, but there's no office, no bills," she warned me. I defended Ethan. "Mom, you don't understand. Times have changed. This is how young people do business now," I said. Deep down, I was uneasy too, but accepting the truth that a father's son could be a failure, even a liar, hurt me more than having a needle stuck in my paralyzed leg. Maybe I didn't want to see the truth. A father's greatest weakness is his belief in his child, and Ethan was using that belief like a credit card, maxing it out. On the surface, the years passed quietly. Ethan said things were settling down, that he would soon pay off all his debts to me. Until that Sunday dinner, I had no idea that behind that mask, a dark tumor was growing, that my own flesh and blood, my son, was the architect of a plan no father could ever imagine in his worst nightmares. And this plan would only fall apart because Clara had been caught on my mother's infallible radar. That day, I would learn that love can sometimes create a blindness more dangerous than the sharpest blade. The road to that Sunday dinner was full of sharp turns and cliff edges, but I was asleep at the wheel with a father's blind confidence. It all began a few months before that fateful dinner, with a series of unfortunate coincidences. The first warning shot came on one of Seattle's famously rain-slickened hills. Since my paralysis, I had been using a specially equipped, hand-controlled old minibus. That day I was returning from the market. Descending Queen Anne Hill, I pushed the lever to hit the brakes, but the lever moved forward without resistance, as if I were in mid-air. There was no sound of metal scraping against metal, no slowing down, just the terrifying acceleration of gravity. The minibus sped up. My wheelchair screeched behind me, while I clung to the handbrake, breaking out in a cold sweat. When I finally scraped along the curb and knocked over a mailbox to a stop, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst through my ribcage. When I explained the situation to Ethan, the look on his face was more weary than worried. "Dad, it's way past time to get rid of that piece of junk," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "It's fallen into disrepair. The cables are rotten. You need a new, safer vehicle now. Maybe we should cash in your life insurance for a down payment. What do you think?" At that moment, I thought his suggestion was the protective instinct of a son who cared about me. But he was trying to turn my fear into a bargaining chip. Even when the mechanic said the brake cable was worn abnormally, I dismissed it, saying, "It's metal fatigue." Because the thought that my son's hand could be on that cable is further from a father's mind than death itself. The second accident happened within the safe confines of my own home, on the wheelchair ramp leading down to the backyard. Years ago, Ethan and I had built that ramp together. Or so I wanted to remember. I took the measurements while he hammered the nails. One afternoon, I wanted to go out into the garden with my chair to get some air. When I reached the middle of the ramp, the wood beneath me split with a terrible crack. The left wheel fell into the void. If my reflexes hadn't weakened so much, and I hadn't clung to the railing with all my strength, I would have crashed onto the concrete ground from a height of 1.5 meters with my paralyzed body. I only hurt my shoulder, but a deeper crack formed in my soul. When Ethan came home, he looked at the broken boards of the ramp and shook his head. "This house is falling apart, Dad," he said, his voice almost accusatory. "Woodworm, damp, old materials. It's not safe for you here anymore. You should think about selling it. How about moving to a modern apartment in the city center, with an elevator and security? You could use the remaining money to support me in my work." It was the same old refrain. Sell it, convert it to cash, give it to me. At that moment, I found his desire to wipe out our home and our memories with a stroke of a pen. Strange, but I put it down to his concern for my safety. "It's just a few boards that need replacing, son," I said stubbornly. "This is my home. The last straw, or rather the last drop that broke Clara's patience, was about my medication. I always kept my blood pressure and blood thinner pills in that little porcelain bowl on the kitchen counter. For a few weeks after taking my pills, I started to feel strange. Dizziness, nausea, and a lethargy that pinned me to the chair. Old age, I told myself. The body is failing. One day when Clara came to visit, she was examining that porcelain bowl while I was drinking water. She narrowed her eyes, picked up a pill with her trembling hands, and held it up to the light. "Arthur," she said sharply, "why are these pills a different color? Yours were sky blue, these are chalk white." "The pharmacy changed brands, Mom," I said, rubbing my eyes as my head spun. "It doesn't matter." "It does matter," she thundered, tapping her cane on the floor. I know the pharmacist. He's been giving me the same medicine for 20 years. We're throwing these in the trash right now." Without giving me a chance to protest, she emptied the entire box into the toilet and flushed it. That day, at her insistence, we got a new box from the pharmacy. And miraculously, that dizziness, that nausea, was gone like a knife the next day. All these events, the car, the ramp, the medications, seemed like misfortunes when viewed individually. But my mother Clara was preparing to bring down a sledgehammer on my wall of denial. One evening, as rain pelted the window, she sat down beside my wheelchair and took my hand. "You need to open your eyes, Arthur," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but heavy as lead. "These aren't accidents. They are tests." I pulled my hand away angrily. "What are you implying, Mom? Ethan is my son. He bathes me. He brings me my food. He is my life." "Sometimes your life hurts you, son," Clara said sadly. "That boy is trapped, and trapped animals bite, even those they love most." I treated her worse than if I had kicked her out that night. I accused her of paranoia, of senility, but the seed had been planted. I couldn't sleep that night. Watching the shadows on the ceiling, I fought the cold suspicion growing inside me. The next morning, suspicion turned me into a thief. While Ethan was in the shower, the phone he left on the kitchen table vibrated. I did something I would never normally do. I quietly pulled my chair up to the table and looked at the screen. Notifications were flooding in, but these weren't messages from friends or work emails. "Time's up, Ethan. Find the money or we'll talk to your dad. Interest has accrued. Last 48 hours. Betting is no joke, coach. You'll face the consequences." The numbers I saw were staggering. $50,000, $80,000, and threats from unfamiliar, sinister names. Before I could read any more, I heard the water shut off. My heart pounding in my throat, I quickly pulled my chair back and pretended to read my newspaper. But I couldn't make sense of a single word I was reading. My world had gone dark in the light of that small screen. That evening, Ethan called me. His voice sounded cheerful, as if all those debts and threats didn't exist, even relieved. "Dad," he said, "I'll make you a special dinner on Sunday. Just you, me, and Grandma. We have things to talk about. I'll set everything straight." That phrase, "I'll set everything straight," now sounded less like a promise and more like a threat in light of what I knew. Perhaps foolishly hopeful, I thought he would tell me the truth, ask for help. "Okay, son," I said, praying my voice wouldn't tremble. When I called Clara, before I could explain the situation, she said, "I'll be there." Her voice was ice cold. "I'm coming to see my granddaughter and what she's become." At that moment, I sensed that Clara wasn't just coming for dinner, she was preparing for war. But accepting that the enemy would be our own blood across the table was harder than dying. The hours leading up to that Sunday evening were as heavy and stifling as the final walk of a condemned man. The house felt charged with the pressure of the approaching storm. Ethan had been in the kitchen since early morning. My son, who was usually incapable of cracking an egg, was working with the precision of a chemist that day. The sounds coming from the kitchen, knife chopping, pots clanging, were supposed to be the comforting sounds of home. But that day, they sounded like the drums of war to my ears. Sitting in the living room in my wheelchair, I heard Ethan whistling, a cheerful, rhythmic melody. It chilled my blood that a man planning to kill his father could be so cheerful. At that moment, I realized that my son was no longer just a victim of debt, but a stranger who had long since surrendered his conscience. When the doorbell rang, I started the motor of my wheelchair and headed for the door. It was Clara, my mother. Despite being 90 years old, she stood straight, but her face lacked its usual soft, grandmotherly expression. She looked like a statue carved from stone. The first thing that caught my attention was the old leather bag she clutched tightly in her lap. She usually only took a small handbag with her. This large bag hung down as if it carried a heavy secret inside. "Welcome, Mom," I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. She looked into my eyes, scanned my soul with those piercing blue eyes, and whispered, "Are you ready, Arthur?" I didn't ask what I was ready for. I just nodded. At that moment, we both knew this dinner was not a celebration, but an execution or a ceremony of salvation. When we sat down at the table, Ethan emerged from the kitchen carrying plates steaming with smoke. His face wore the exaggerated excitement of an actor on a theater stage. "Here's the star of the night," he said, setting the tray on the table. There were 3 plates. The 2 for Clara and himself looked ordinary, but the plate he placed in front of me— "This one's special for you, Dad," he said, pushing the plate toward me. "Lots of spices, just the way you like it. I put less in the others so it wouldn't burn their stomachs." The smell of the sauce stung my nostrils. This smell, which should have made my mouth water, reminded me of something rotten, of death. Ethan was standing there, wiping his hands on his apron and hovering over me like a waiter. "Come on, Dad. Don't be cold. I'm waiting for you to taste it." At that moment, I saw Clara staring at me without moving the hands in her lap. There was a silent scream in her eyes. When my phone vibrated in my pocket, I flinched and reached for it. Ethan asked, "Who is it, Dad? Is this a good time?" His voice suddenly tense. "It's just an ad," I lied. Peering at the screen from under the table, I saw my mother's life-saving message. "Son, pretend you're sick. Get out immediately. Don't eat anything. Trust me." The moment I read the message, the imaginary cramp I felt in my stomach became real. Fear, like an icy hand, squeezed my intestines. I lifted my head and looked at Ethan. That face, those familiar features, but the darkness behind them could no longer be hidden. "Ah!" I groaned, pressing my hand to my stomach. This time I didn't need to fake it. The pain of betrayal stabbed into my chest, sharper than any physical ache. "Dad?" Ethan took a step closer. "My stomach," I said, grimacing. "I think it's a side effect of the medicine. I need to go to the bathroom." I grabbed the arm of my chair. The whirring of the motor broke the silence. Ethan said, "Dad, wait. It'll pass. Drink some water. Eat your meal. It'll help," he said, trying to hold the arm of my chair. That touch. The moment my son's hand touched my arm, I flinched as if a snake's skin had brushed against me. I quickly pulled my arm away. "Let go!" I shouted, perhaps more harshly than I had intended. Ethan recoiled in shock. For a moment, pure fear flashed in his eyes, the fear of being caught. I spun the wheelchair quickly and wheeled it down the hallway, then toward the veranda door leading to the backyard. I was running away from my own home, my own son, the life I had built over the years. When I reached the threshold, I looked back, driven by an impulse I couldn't explain. And that scene was etched into the darkest corner of my mind. Ethan, sitting at the table, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his face contorted with anger and disappointment, staring at my mother. Clara, meanwhile, sat there with the unwavering dignity of 90 years, not looking at the harmless food in front of her, but directly into the eyes of her murderous grandson. When I stepped out onto the porch, the night air hit me like a slap in the face. It had started to drizzle. I pulled my wheelchair into a dark corner, positioning myself so I could see the kitchen window. My hands were shaking, my teeth were chattering. I couldn't hear what was happening inside, but I could see it. Ethan was gesturing wildly, and my mother was shaking her head. Then came that terrible moment. Ethan, in a fit of rage, grabbed my plate. He dipped the spoon in and held it out toward my mother. He was forcing her to eat it. My heart nearly stopped. I wanted to break the glass and rush inside, but my paralyzed legs pinned me to that chair. Clara refused, holding her head high. And then Ethan did the unthinkable, perhaps to prove his innocence, or perhaps in a moment of madness without knowing what he was doing. He put that poisoned spoon in his own mouth. Time froze in that moment. I watched my son swallow, watching that deadly bite descend his throat in slow motion. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then Ethan's eyes widened. He brought his hand to his throat. His face turned a color I had never seen before, ash gray. He tried to hold on to the chair, but his legs wouldn't carry him. As he collapsed to the floor, he pulled the tablecloth with him. Plates and glasses scattered across the floor with a loud crash, though it sounded muffled from beyond the glass. Clara calmly stood up. She opened her enormous bag and pulled out a bottle. She bent over her grandson, who was writhing on the floor. I couldn't hide anymore. No matter what. He was my son. I revved up my wheelchair's motor to full power and rushed inside. The scene was like the aftermath of an apocalypse. Broken porcelain on the floor, sauce stains, and my son, convulsing. Foam was coming from his mouth. "Mom!" I shouted. "What did you do?" Clara turned to me, showing me the small bottle in her hand. "I didn't do anything, Arthur. He ate his own fate. This is emetic syrup, to keep him alive." In that moment, I realized my mother was not just a victim, but a general who had calculated every possibility. As the ambulance sirens began to sound in the distance, I looked at my son struggling on the floor and started to cry. For a father, the death of a child is painful, but seeing your child as a murderer is worse than death. As I watched my son writhing on the living room floor, I lost track of time. Seconds stretched into hours, and Ethan's raspy breaths became the most painful symphony a father could hear. Clara, my mother, had set aside the empty syringe of emetic syrup and now held Ethan's head on her lap. She stroked her grandson's hair with one hand while turning his head to the side with the other to prevent him from choking. This image was both tender and terrifying. A grandmother holding the grandson who poisoned her, yet also thwarting his plan and pushing him to the brink of death. "Why?" I moaned, my voice choked with tears. "Why did he do this, Mom?" Without lifting her head, Clara replied in a cold voice, "Because sometimes ambition is thicker than blood, Arthur." The sirens outside grew closer, red and blue lights dancing on my window. These lights were turning the home where I had found peace for years into a crime scene. The door burst open with a loud bang, and the paramedics rushed in. Men and women in orange uniforms, their radios crackling. The moment they entered the room, they surrounded Ethan with professional composure. I was stuck in a corner in my wheelchair, a useless spectator. "What did he take? What was the dose?" one of the team shouted. I froze, the words stuck in my throat. Clara spoke again. Her voice was sharp and clear, like a knife in the midst of chaos. Organophosphate. Rat poison. It was in the food. She swallowed it about 10 minutes ago. I gave her some syrup to make her vomit, but I don't know how much she got up. The paramedic looked at the old woman in astonishment. "How do you know that, ma'am?" he asked, putting an oxygen mask on Ethan. Clara replied without the slightest hint of emotion on her face. "Because I recognize the smell, and I know my grandson." The paramedic asked no more questions. They were racing against time. When we loaded Ethan onto the stretcher, my son's arm dangled limply. That arm, the arm I taught to ride a bike, the arm I lifted into the air when he caught his first ball. "Who's coming from the family?" asked the attendant, who moved to the driver's seat. "Me," I said, pushing my wheelchair forward. "I'm his father." I looked at Clara. "You need to come too, Mom." She shook her head. "I'm staying here, Arthur. I have to give a statement to the police, and I have to clean this house. You go. Be with your son. Whatever he did, he's still your son." As the ambulance's rear doors closed behind me, I saw my mother standing guard at our front door with that huge leather bag. In that moment, I felt that she had stayed there not only to protect me from the poison, but also from that first, most devastating blow of the truth. The inside of the ambulance reeked of disinfectant and fear. The rhythmic beeps of the monitors echoed Ethan's weak heartbeat. They secured my wheelchair, and I reached out to hold my son's cold hand. This hand had tried to kill me just minutes ago. This hand had put poison in my plate. But I, with a father's damn instinct, was still trying to warm that hand. "Why, Ethan?" I whispered, so quietly that no one could hear. "What did I fail you?" Ethan's eyes were half open, but his gaze was empty. His consciousness was fading in and out. For a moment, just a moment, his eyes met mine. I couldn't tell if there was regret in that look, or just pain. His lips moved. I leaned in. "Debts," he growled. "They were going to kill me, Dad." When we arrived at the hospital, they took Ethan to the red zone, the emergency room. They directed me to the waiting room, that limbo filled with gray, cold plastic chairs. I pulled my wheelchair into a corner. There were other people around me. A crying mother, a worker with a bandaged arm, a coughing elderly person. But I was the loneliest man in the world. My own son had tried to kill me. My mind refused to accept this reality, but my heart was already shattered. A little while later, Clara appeared at the door. A neighbor must have brought her. She came over to me not with her usual composure, but this time with a mother's weariness, and sat down beside me. She took my hand. "Tell me everything, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "How did you know about the poison? How did you know he was going to do it today?" Clara took a deep breath. She fixed her eyes on the fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor. "Yesterday," she said, "when I brought you that peach tart. Ethan was in the backyard on the phone. He didn't see me. His voice was trembling, but what he said was clear." "What did he say?" I asked, afraid of the answer. "It will be over tomorrow night," he said. "It will look natural. They'll say his heart gave out. The insurance money will come in next week, and then I'll pay you all back." He was talking about insurance, Arthur. Your life insurance. Those words were more potent than Ethan's poison. Insurance. The premiums I'd paid for years, scraping and saving, so that if I died, he could be comfortable. My death was his promissory note. So, I said, my voice cracking, the value of my life is only as much as his gambling debts? Clara squeezed my hand, so hard it hurt my bones. It's not for him, Arthur. He's not the Ethan we knew anymore. He's a stranger driven by fear and greed. And that stranger, while he was digging your grave last night, I swore I'd stop him. Our conversation was interrupted when the doctor appeared at the door. He was a man in a green coat with tired eyes. He walked towards us. "Arthur Vance?" he asked. "Yes," I said, straightening my chair. Is my son alive?" The doctor shook his head. He was treated in time. The emetic syrup prevented most of the poison from entering his bloodstream. We pumped his stomach and gave him the antidote. His condition is stable but critical. I took a deep breath. My son was alive, but the father inside me had died. "However," the doctor said hesitantly, "the police are at the door. This is a poisoning case, and it appears to be intentional. You'll need to make a statement, Mr. Vance." I nodded. Police, courts, newspaper headlines. Unfilial son poisons disabled father. My family's honor, my privacy, all would be fodder for the third page of tomorrow's newspapers. But at that moment, none of that mattered to me. All I could think about was the emetic syrup in Clara's huge bag. My mother, instead of handing her granddaughter over to the police, had given her one more chance, but at the same time, she had given her the ultimate punishment, the punishment of tasting her own poison. The police officers walking toward me in the hospital corridor felt like the longest scene of my life. One was an older detective, his face hardened by years of professional skepticism. The other was a young, formal officer waiting with a notebook in his hand. When the detective reached me, he bent slightly to come level with my wheelchair. This gesture was less about courtesy and more about the attitude of a hunter sizing up his prey at eye level. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice as rough as cigarette smoke. "I'm Detective Miller. We need to talk about what happened tonight. The doctor says your son had rat poison in his stomach. And your mother insists it wasn't an accident." The words refused to leave my mouth. Forming the sentence, "My son tried to kill me," was equivalent to shooting myself in the heart. I looked at Clara. She sat beside me, sitting up straight, her encouraging gaze saying, "Speak, Arthur. Set the truth free." I took a deep breath. The hospital air filling my lungs burned my throat, and I began to tell her. About that fateful Sunday dinner, the message that came, my escape, what I saw from the window. With every word, Ethan ceased to be just my son and became a case number in the police records. When I finished speaking, Detective Miller closed his notebook, but kept his eyes on me. "Mr. Vance," he said, his tone softening slightly, "what you've told us is just the tip of the iceberg. Our teams are currently searching your son's apartment. And the initial findings, how should I put it? They paint a much more complex picture than you imagined." "What do you mean?" I asked. "What else could there be? You said your son had a consulting office, right? In the city center?" "Yes, I fixed. Investment consulting." The detective shook his head with a bitter smile. "There is no such office, Mr. Vance. The address he gave is a warehouse that's been empty for months. Clients, contracts, investments, it's all made up. Your son would leave home in the morning saying he was going to work, but he'd spend his days at casinos or horse racing bookmakers." This information left me speechless. The story I had proudly told for years, boasting, "My son is a businessman," was nothing but a cheap lie. So those suits, those important meeting phone calls, they were all just for show. I was the only audience member at a play, and I paid for the ticket with my own life. The detective continued. The only real documents we found in your home were your life insurance policy and copies of your property deeds. And then there were the debt ledgers, loan sharks, betting sites. A total debt of nearly $50,000. $50,000, I whispered. I turned the number over and over in my mind. So that's the price of my life? $50,000? The detective shook his head. Not just to cover the debts. Your insurance, your house, your land, all together, the amount he would get his hands on exceeded $300,000. Enough money to pay off his debts and live a life of luxury. So killing you wasn't just a way out for him. It was also a bonus. $300,000. A father's love, sleepless nights, years spent on the docks, the struggle with his paralyzed body, all reduced to a number on a piece of paper. My stomach churned. I wanted to vomit, but my stomach was empty. There was only bitter bile and disappointment. At that moment, Clara took my hand. "Listen to me, Arthur," she said, her voice firm but compassionate. "He thought he'd get that money with your death. But he forgot one thing. You're not just an insurance policy. You're a father. And fathers give their lives for their children, but not their honor. Tonight, he lost not only his inheritance, but his father." My mother's words were my only source of light in the darkness of that moment. I turned to the police. "I want to see him," I said. "Before you take his statement, I want him to look me in the face." The detective hesitated. "He's stable now, but he's still under police supervision. Also, his psychological state." "I don't care," I cut him off, pushing my wheelchair forward. "I'm not the victim. I'm his father, and I'm going to end this story before he does." When I entered Ethan's room, he looked tiny in his bed. IVs in his arms, an oxygen tube in his nose. The police officer at the door left to give us privacy, but left it ajar. I rolled my wheelchair up to his bedside. His eyes were closed, but I knew he wasn't asleep. His eyelids were twitching. "Ethan," I said. My voice came out stronger than I expected. He opened his eyes. In those eyes, I searched for the remnants of the innocence I had once seen. I searched for the eyes that had looked at me when he cut his knee as a child. But they weren't there. There was only emptiness, shame, and fear. The eyes of a stranger. "Why?" I asked again. It was the only question I knew the answer to but needed to hear. "Just for the money? Really?" Ethan fixed his gaze on the ceiling, avoiding eye contact with me too. His voice was hoarse from the irritation in his throat. "You don't understand, Dad. You never did." "What don't I understand? That I love you? That I gave you everything?" "You gave me everything," he said, his voice suddenly hardening. "That's the problem. You never let me earn anything. Whenever I was in trouble, you were there. Whenever I fell, you picked me up. I never learned to fight. And those men, when those loan sharks came knocking, you couldn't save me. The only way out was your inheritance." The accusation hit harder than poison. My kindness, my love, my protectiveness, all of it had turned into a weapon pointed at me. So I was the guilty one? Because I loved him so much, because I protected him too much from life's difficulties, perhaps because of my own disability. "No, Ethan," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I protected you because you were wounded when your mother left. I protected you because when I was paralyzed, you were my walking legs. But you chose the easy way, and now that easy way is leading you to a prison cell. I backed away toward the door. Without looking back at the stranger lying in bed, I left the room. Clara was waiting for me in the hallway. She looked at my face, saw my tears, and took my hand without saying a word. At that moment, I realized I hadn't left my son in the Aromioma. Among those IVs, I had lost him years ago with that first lie, that first act of convenience. And now, it was only time to mourn. Ethan's arrest process felt like a soul crushed between the cold, metallic gears of bureaucracy. After our last glance in the hospital room, the officer initiated the formal procedure. "Ethan Vance," he said, his voice echoing like a verdict. "You are under arrest for attempted premeditated murder against your father, Arthur Vance." Ethan did not protest, did not cry, did not even lift his head. He was like a statue staring into emptiness. In that moment, I saw that my son had lost not only his conscience but also his will to live. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, the clinking of metal was the final farewell note echoing in my heart. I had once held those wrists to teach him to walk. Now a police officer was walking him behind bars. When Clara and I left the hospital, the rain had stopped outside, but the air was filled with Seattle's famous, bone-chilling dampness. We got into a taxi. We didn't say a word the whole way. The silence was like a third passenger sitting between us, heavy, suffocating, and accusatory. As I put my wheelchair in the trunk, the taxi driver muttered something cheerful, but when he saw the look on our faces, he fell silent. As the city lights flowed past the window, I could only see the darkness behind them. Each streetlight illuminated a memory I shared with Ethan, then plunged it back into darkness. The first ice cream in the park, high school graduation, his first day at work. All of them were now tainted, all part of a poisonous lie. When we arrived home, the scene was even more striking. Police tape had been stretched across the front door, but the detectives had finished their work. When we removed the tape and went inside, I saw that time had frozen in that terrible moment. The dining table was still overturned. The porcelain shards on the floor, the sauce stains, and that invisible mark left where Ethan had fallen. Everything was just as it had been. I stood in the middle of the mess in my wheelchair. This had been my refuge, my pen. But now, it was indistinguishable from a crime scene. As I looked at the sauce stain on the floor, I felt that imaginary cramp in my stomach return. There was no peace in this house anymore, only ghosts. Clara moved with surprising energy for her age. She put her bag aside, took off her coat, and said, "Come on, Arthur. Standing here won't heal the wound. We need to clean it up." "I can't, Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "I can't touch it. It's my son's betrayal." "It's just sauce, Arthur," Clara said firmly, "and we're going to clean this house, because life goes on, and we won't live in filth." Her pragmatic attitude brought me back to myself. She was right. I could mourn, but I couldn't give up. I rolled my wheelchair into the kitchen, grabbed the broom and dustpan. Mother and son, at that hour of the night, we quietly began to clean up the remnants of betrayal on the floor. With every shard of glass I tossed into the dustpan, I felt a piece of myself going into the trash. When we were done, Clara brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch. We were exhausted, but sleep was far from either of us. I sat down next to her, gripping the steaming cup with my trembling hands. "You know, Mom," I said, looking out at the night. "Ethan told me, you never understood. You never let me learn to fight back," he said. Was he right? Did I create this monster? Clara sighed deeply. The knitting needles weren't in her hands this time, but her fingers moved as if casting an imaginary stitch in the air. "When you love someone the way I love you, Arthur, blind spots form. You wanted to give him everything because you wanted him to have what you didn't have as a child. That's not a crime. That's fatherhood. But this is the result," I said painfully. "The result was his choices, Arthur," Clara corrected. "There are thousands of children who grew up under the same circumstances and remained honest. Ethan chose the easy way out. And you just didn't think he could fall that far. Because love wants to believe in the best version of the one you love." Clara's words lifted the fog in my mind. "What about you?" I asked. "How did you see it? I was blind living in the same house with him every day. How did you see everything so clearly?" Clara turned to me, the moonlight illuminating the deep lines on her face. "Because I was looking at him from a distance, son. When you look up close, you get lost in the details, but from a distance you see the pattern. I saw the shadow in his eyes. I saw that fake smile he wore around you, the weariness that settled on his face the moment he turned his back, the urgency in his voice, his avoidance of touching you." She paused, placing her hand on mine. "And most importantly, Arthur, I am a mother. A mother senses danger even in the wind's direction if her child is in harm's way. Ethan was going to hurt you. I felt it. And there is no power in the world that can stop a mother from protecting her child, even if it's her own grandchild." This confession overwhelmed me with tears. My 90-year-old mother had sacrificed her own blood to protect me, shouldering that terrible burden alone. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said, sobbing, "for not listening to you, for leaving you alone with such pain at your age." "Don't apologize," Clara said, stroking my hair, just like when I was a child. "We survived, Arthur. We're wounded. We're broken. But we're alive. And the walls of this house didn't collapse. We just cleaned out the rot inside." That night, Clara fell asleep on the couch in my room, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but this time the silence wasn't frightening. It was the silence of truth. Painful but honest silence. There were no more lies, no fake deeds, no fake smiles, no poisoned meals. Just two old people and the lives they had left behind. And in that moment, in the midst of all that pain, I felt a strange peace, because I knew that no matter how far I fell, those calloused, wrinkled hands that would pick me up were still right there beside me. The weeks that followed were the gravest period of my life. A limbo where the sky was perpetually overcast, and time melted away in court corridors and lawyers' offices. Ethan, on his lawyer's advice, entered into a plea bargain with the prosecution. He admitted to all charges, naming the loan sharks and detailing the locations of the casinos one by one. In return, he received a 12-year prison sentence for attempted murder with intent. As the judge read the verdict, I sat in my wheelchair at the back of the courtroom. 12 years, said the judge, banging his gavel. That sound signaled the end of my son's youth and the final death of my dreams of fatherhood. Ethan didn't turn to look. His back hunched, shoulders slumped. He seemed to shrink inside his orange jumpsuit. In that moment, I felt no hatred, only a vast, unfillable emptiness. The day after the decision, I went to the notary to sign one of the hardest documents of my life. Years ago, I sold that plot of land I had bought outside the city, dreaming of building a small cabin there in my retirement. That plot of land was my freedom, the most valuable part of the inheritance I would leave Ethan. But now, I was using that money to save my son, not from prison, but from the other criminals in prison. The long arms of the loan shark seeking revenge could reach behind the bars. I sacrificed the land to hire a good lawyer and have him transferred to a safer, high-security prison. When Clara heard this, she took my hand and said, "You're still his father, Arthur. He tried to kill you, but you want him to live. That's not your weakness. It's your greatness." I changed my will that week, too. The notary asked, "Are you sure, Mr. Vance?" as he reviewed the draft he had prepared. "I'm sure," I said without hesitation. I left most of my estate to a local foundation that supports young people struggling with addiction. For Ethan, I set aside only a small, symbolic amount. This money would be a starting capital for him to build a new life when he completed his sentence and was released. But it would not be a fortune that would spoil him or allow him to live without working. This was not a punishment. It was the most valuable lesson I had ever taught him. What you don't earn is not yours. When I signed the document, I felt a ton of weight lift off my shoulders. Finally, I had fulfilled my duty as a father, albeit in a painful way. It was time to go home. That house where it all happened, where ghosts of memories and betrayal lingered in every corner. I thought about calling the realtors to sell it. Moving to another neighborhood, to a clean apartment free of those memories, seemed appealing. But Clara stopped me. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, she said, "Running away won't erase the memories, Arthur." Yes, Ethan's shadow is in this house. But so is your hard work, my laughter, our past. Are we going to throw away our entire history because of one mistake? She was right. This house was my pen, and I wasn't going to abandon my pen. Instead, I went for a radical change. I hired a renovation crew. I had the walls of the dining room where that fateful meal was eaten torn down, combining it with the kitchen to create an open, airy space. I had the parquet floor where Ethan fell completely removed and replaced with light-colored warm wood. I replaced the furniture and painted the walls a bright color. The construction noise, the hammering, the buzz of the drill, these sounds didn't bother me. On the contrary, they sounded like the sound of healing. Each hammer blow shattered a little more of that dark night from the past. The house was no longer a crime scene, but a new beginning. And the biggest change? Clara. My mother, who was about to turn 91, packed her things and moved in with me as soon as the renovations were finished. "It's not because I need care, you know," she said, placing her suitcase in her room. "I just came because I thought you'd get lonely all alone in this big house." I smiled. We both knew the truth. She was healing me, and I was healing her. Sitting in the renovated living room in the evenings, listening to old records, I was grateful for where life had brought us. Yes, my son was in prison. Yes, I had been betrayed. But I wasn't alone. The woman who would protect me at any cost, the woman who said, "Mothers know," was by my side. One day, as we drank coffee on the renovated porch, Clara turned to me. "I never imagined my grandson would do such a thing," she said sadly. "But I never doubted for a moment that I could do anything to protect you, son. A mother is a mother, no matter her age." I held her hand. that wrinkled, veiny, life-filled hand. "I know, Mom," I said, "and I owe my life to that message, to that phrase, act sick." Clara smiled, her eyes drifting into the distance. "The message was just a tool, Arthur. What saved you was the bond between us. Ethan severed that bond, but we tied the knot even tighter." Today, nearly 6 months after that fateful meal, my life has settled into a new and strange rhythm. The most prominent mark on my calendar is that gray ritual I repeat every first Tuesday of the month: the state prison visit. Early in the morning, I leave the house before Clara wakes up. As I drive along the highway in my specially equipped minivan, the cityscape gives way to barren fields and finally that massive concrete complex. Passing through security in my wheelchair is a humiliation in itself. Metal detectors, detailed searches, grim-faced guards checking between my wheels. Every time I want to shout, "I'm not a criminal, I'm just a father." But I stay silent. This silence is the price I pay to see my son. The visiting room reeks of disinfectant and despair. I will never forget the first moment I saw Ethan behind the glass. He wasn't the Ethan I remembered. His hair was shaved, his face gaunt, his shoulders lost in that orange jumpsuit. He looked away when he saw me. The pride I used to see in those eyes had been replaced by deep shame. When I picked up the receiver, the coldness of the metal pierced my heart. "Hello, Dad," he said, his voice weak even over the crackling line. "I didn't think you'd come." "I came," I said simply. Because a father cannot leave his child completely alone behind that concrete wall, no matter what they've done. Whether that was love or conscience, I'm still not sure. Our conversations are usually brief and stilted. We talk about the weather, prison food, what the lawyer said last. In other words, everything except that terrible night. He rarely looks me in the eye. Sometimes, in those brief moments of silence, I search Ethan for traces of that little boy inside him, that innocence that cried when he fell off his bike. But I can't find it. The man sitting across from me is a cold-blooded stranger who planned to poison his own father. Once I asked, "Are you sorry?" He paused for a long time before answering. "I'm sorry for what I did, Dad," he finally said. "But most of all, I'm sorry for killing the trust you had in me. I know I can't bring it back." This confession was perhaps the most honest thing I've ever heard. Still, even behind these words, I can't help but wonder if there's still manipulation lurking. Once trust is broken, every word becomes suspect. The hardest part of my visits is the journey home. When I get on the highway in my minibus, I look back at that concrete block I've left behind in the rearview mirror. My son is there, just a number among thousands of criminals. I am free, but the taste of that freedom is bitter. When I arrive home, Clara greets me in her usual spot, knitting on the renovated porch. She never asks, "How did it go?" She reads the answer in my expression. She just pours the tea and sits down next to me, holding my hand. Her presence is the only thing that wipes that prison coldness from my soul. Last night, sitting in front of the fireplace, I asked Clara, "Mom, can I ever truly forgive him?" She stopped clicking her needles. "Forgiving isn't something you do for Ethan, Arthur," she said wisely. "Forgiving means expelling that poison from within yourself. You must forgive not to free him from prison, but to free yourself from the prison of that moment. But remember, forgiving is not trusting. You open the door, but you don't give the key back." My mother's words opened a new window in my mind. For months, I had blamed myself. I thought I was a bad father because I couldn't forgive, a bad person because I couldn't trust. But Clara was right. Love wasn't blindness. Love was seeing the truth in all its nakedness and still choosing not to hate. The prison psychologist says Ethan is working on his gambling addiction and narcissistic tendencies. These terms sound cold and clinical to me. The only truth I know is this. My son is paying the price for having everything come easily in life by having nothing at all. I, on the other hand, am paying the price of not being able to say no to him by seeing him behind bars. We are both in our own prisons, he behind iron bars, I in my wheelchair and my memories. But there is one difference. The door to my prison is opened by Clara's love. During my last visit, just before we parted, Ethan pressed his hand against the glass. I placed my hand against his, even though there was thick glass between us. Our palms didn't touch. No warmth passed between us. There was only the cold surface of the glass. "Take care of yourself, Dad," he said. For the first time, I heard the fragility of his childhood in his voice. "You too," I said, turning around and pushing my wheelchair toward the exit. I was no longer crying. I had simply accepted it. This was our story. A wounded, flawed, broken father-son story that somehow still continued. Today, my life is much simpler, much quieter, yet paradoxically much fuller than before. Every morning when I wake up and see the faint sunlight filtering through Seattle's gray clouds, I give thanks for that first breath I take into my lungs. That breath is a gift given to me. It is a second chance breath, thanks to my mother, Clara, who is 91 years old. She still lives with me in the next room. Her presence, along with the creaking of my wheelchair, forms the background music of this house. When I hear the tapping of her cane in the hallway at night, I feel that this house, which once resembled a horror movie, is now the safest castle in the world. Ethan. My son continues to serve his sentence behind the cold walls of the state prison. I keep visiting him. These visits are no longer heartbreaking like they were in the beginning. They have become more of a some routine. When I went last week, he told me he had started working in the prison library. "Books," he said, averting his eyes. "Take your mind off the noise inside your head, Dad." In that sentence, I found a trace of the old Ethan I knew. Perhaps hope is a stubborn weed that can sprout even in the darkest dungeons. As for his debts, my lawyer and I restructured the legal ones. The others, those shady characters, were rounded up by the police based on Ethan's confessions. The shadows that darkened my son's life were scattered by the light of justice. But the scars those shadows left on his soul will probably take a lifetime to heal. My home, this place which was almost my grave, is now my garden of peace. I said I completely renovated the kitchen, but the biggest change was spiritual. Where Ethan collapsed after tasting his own poison, there is now a small table with flowers that I refresh every day. Every time I look there, I remember not that horrific moment, but Clara's composure in that instant, the strength that saved me. The place where death grazed us is now a corner where life sprouts. This is my personal victory over trauma. I didn't abandon the house. I transformed it. Just as I transformed the wound in my heart into wisdom. The most valuable lesson I learned during this process was about the nature of forgiveness. I used to think that forgiveness meant forgetting what had been done, saying it was insignificant. I was wrong. Forgiveness is accepting the wound as it is and not allowing it to hurt you anymore. Forgiveness is vomiting out that poison. I remind myself of this every day, every morning when I look in the mirror. Clara rarely talks about the events of that night. One evening, sitting in front of the fireplace, I asked her again how she managed to stay so strong that night, how she saw the darkness that I couldn't see. She paused her knitting, looked at me over her glasses, and uttered that legendary sentence. Mothers know, Arthur. Mothers know where their children's shadows fall. Life teaches us its hardest lessons through those we love most. My son, my own flesh and blood, tried to turn me into a statistic for money. My mother, also my own flesh and blood, saved me from the noose with a simple message. Branches of the same tree, but how different the fruit. I finally understood that family isn't just a biology lesson about DNA strands. Family is the decisions we make every day. To love is a decision. To protect is a decision. To betray is a decision. Clara made a decision that night and chose me. Ethan made another decision and chose the darkness. Today I stand between these two decisions, striving to remain on the side of light. And on quiet nights, when the ghosts of the past haunt my mind, I cling to my mother's pragmatic, life-affirming words. You can't live life looking in the rearview mirror, Arthur. Look ahead. The road is there. And that's what I do. Every day I push the wheels of my wheelchair forward, always forward, because I know that as long as I breathe, I have new stories to tell, hot tea to drink, and my mother's hand to hold. If this story of betrayal and redemption, which broke a father's heart but then mended it with love, touched your soul, please leave a like. It's easier than you think to make this old Grandpa Arthur happy. Subscribe to the Notes from a Wheelchair series so you don't miss the other experiences I'll be filtering through life. And write this in the comments. From which corner of the world are you reading this video, these lines, and what time is it for you right now? Have you ever had a guardian angel who saw a danger you couldn't see, who pulled you back from the edge of the cliff? Knowing who is listening on the other side warms this lonely man's heart. I send you a hug as big as my heart, as tight as a Seattle rainy but hopeful day.